I can. Good morning, y'all. How's everyone doing? There's a lot of people here to talk about toxic masculinity, which is great because we want to build a better world. I'm Robin. This is Aaron, Josh, and Blake. And Aaron is going to start us off with a little bit of embodiment so that we're not just talking heads, if that's okay. And we're going to go for 45 minutes or so and then do a little bit of Q&R.
Hi, everybody. So I wanted to begin today with just a moment to get settled and just know that some of the stuff we might talk about could be difficult for our nervous systems, could trigger some stuff. And so if that's the case, we just really want to encourage you to take care of yourselves, whatever that looks like. So you might need to plug your ears and hum or close your eyes or stand up or move around or leave altogether if you need to do that. So just really want to welcome that there's lots of possibilities around this conversation. So I just invite you, if you feel comfortable, you might want to close your eyes for just a moment. I'm going to close my eyes too. And just notice where your awareness goes. And if it feels possible, just noticing what parts of your body are supported. Perhaps you can feel your seat on the chair coming up to meet you. And just taking a moment, if it feels possible, to offer gratitude and to just receive that support, that very simple support. And in that, also just receiving the support of gravity. And you might even feel some parts of your body that are holding tension just soften a little bit. And maybe they're not ready to do that, and that's fine too. And if you would like to, you might even invite a different quality into your breath. And just inhaling whatever it is you need more of today, and releasing what's not serving you in this moment. And so just maintaining, as much as it might be possible, this connection with the ground, with gravity, with your seat, with your senses. Maintaining this as you also allow some of your attention to fluctuate towards this conversation. And as you're ready, you might just gently, slowly allow your eyelids to open. Maybe take a little look around this particular space that we're in. Maybe just seeing the other people around you, looking behind you if that's possible. Just sort of noticing your surroundings. Right. So welcome back. So we're gonna get into a conversation around disrupting toxic masculinity. And so to begin, we're just gonna riff off of what is toxic masculinity to us, maybe how we've experienced it and or perpetuated it. And then hopefully we'll move into the later part of our conversation, which is what do we envision as a new type of masculinity, a masculinity that is nurturing and that is supportive of life. So we'll start with the shit, and then we'll move into, hopefully, something that we can all imagine and co-create together.
And if I could just start, you might be wondering why these particular bodies are talking about toxic masculinity. And I would say that each of us have experienced or have been conscripted into masculinity, and that we each have a very particular sort of standpoint or perspective on masculinity and the toxicity of some versions of masculinity. And so we each are going to share from our particular standpoint, and I don't want to go first.
I don't either.
Josh, why don't you go first?
Oh, I don't think I should go first. Do you want me to go?
Well, yeah, I mean,
I actually was.
Yeah.
If I did not have such a deep love, friendship, and trust for Dr. Robin, I would have thought that I was being brought here as like Exhibit A or something. Which
You are the
because we
scapegoat.
have such a deep friendship.
yeah.
I knew
So
that's-
Exhibit A, will you please step forward as
Yes.
tribute?
So it's interesting. I thought about this a lot the other day because there was this video going around on the internet.
Was it TikTok?
No, I don't have that. I'm not good at technology. But it was with this candidate for governor, maybe of Pennsylvania or something. I can't, don't, but, and he had this line. He was like doing this rant, and he had this line: "We need to make men again." WTF does that mean? Like, what does that mean? And I think for me, this image sort of that has been so pervasive in our culture of this is what a man is. They're generally, it's just, it never worked for me in the sense of, like, I never saw anything in those qualities like, I want to be that. I want to be this person who is sort of just, the world is mine, I'm going to boss everybody around, and I'm never going to cry or show emotion. I'm never, just all of this stuff that gets so beat into you, whether it's through watching movies or whether it's through just playing, like I played, playing Little League as a kid, and just having, this is what it is. This is what you aspire to, is sort of this disconnected, self-interested. And so it was always just for me, I was like, I think there has to be a better way. There has to be a better way. And so for me, I always just realized that it has been so much the air that I breathe, though, and so much the water that I've been drinking, that it's part of me even when I'm not aware of it being part of me, right? Which is the work.
And you and I both come from the same denominational home and have been shown a very particular version of masculinity that is a little bit narcissistic.
A little bit.
Well, I'm trying to be gentle. It's only 10 o'clock in the morning.
It's like every year when they had Baptist Men's Day, I'd be like, isn't that like every Sunday?
Right.
What?
Right.
Yeah.
And so both of us have found a way to navigate some of that, which has been kind of treacherous terrain, and we've both chosen a different path, but we've kind of had to make it up as we go in many respects, opting out of the toxicity, but it's almost like the tide of the ocean, we get pulled back into it because of what we get asked to do.
Yeah, and so I'll give you a great example, and I mean, it may not seem like a great example, but I am terrible. I am terrible at like anything to do with like building things, fixing things, like handy things. I'm terrible at it, and every time I end up having to do something, I do it wrong the first time. I literally worked at Walmart for a week after high school. And they put me in the garden center, and I put together a swing, and it took me 4 hours. And then I realized I'd put it together backwards. So I had to take it apart and put it back together again. And it took me another 4 hours, and we agreed that that's probably not the career path for me. But what happens to me when I can't do a thing that a man does, and like most of my friends are really good at that stuff, but there is this intense amount of shame for me, and this intense amount of, you should be able to do this. Like, you should be able to go watch a YouTube video and figure out it is just an Allen wrench. I do know what an Allen wrench is. It's just an Allen wrench. But that is one of the places for me where it's like, this is what a man is and does, and you clearly aren't that.
And if you can't do it, then you're like less than. And to be less than a man is also part of the toxicity.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's a really kind of silly, maybe simple, but that for me, that's when I become aware that, there's still this stuff inside of me that I'm not aware of most of the time, this stuff that I don't believe, this stuff that if somebody came up to me and said that, I would have said, oh my gosh, no. I hear you, but no, that's not how this works. But when it's my own narrative and the tape playing in my head, it's a whole different thing.
Blake, you want to talk about your experience of masculinity and this version of yourself today?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think for me, the sort of foundational conception of masculinity was a really kind of settler colonial interpretation of the passage in Genesis about be fruitful, multiply, subdue, control, have dominion over the earth. And for me, what that has meant is that masculinity has looked like control and power, and has looked like framing the world in a way that is not true to reality, and then forcing the boundaries upon everyone, including those who would identify as masculine. And I see this in a variety of ways, but I think particularly for me, around gender expression, around what is considered masculine or feminine. It's funny because I'm really handy, so that's always fun.
Blake put together my new smoker that I got
did,
for my
I did.
birthday, and I loved it because I could just sit
this is
there.
Blake.
Yeah, that's me.
Hi.
Hi, nice
I've
to
heard
meet
all
you.
about you.
Yeah. I feel a little responsible. Robin was like, I've got this Weber grill, and I was like, girl, let me get my tools. Come on over. Yes, it'd be great. But even that, why the things that why do we draw boundaries around particular things as masculine, feminine? And I think it gets to this idea of control and naming, and who gets to determine what is valid, what is in, what is out, all of those ideas of power and control. That toxic masculinity says my perspective or our perspective in this particular kind of body is valid. Everyone else's is, if not invalid, is not as pure as mine. Perhaps. And my role here is to force that parameter upon everyone else. And that feels kind of like the core of toxic masculinity for me. And so for my particular journey, it has meant since adolescence, growing up in the evangelical church, it's been an intentionally or unintentionally often playing a role because I felt like I had to fit. I had to fit in a box that in order to have access to safety, security, material needs, et cetera. And I think that to kind of understand toxic masculinity is fundamentally a power analysis. It's trying to understand the ways in which power has been historically and continues to be positioned in a way that is, if not male-bodied, but is embodied in masculine, quote-unquote, traits. And I think that, there's just a lot to unpack there, but I'm just very interested in that idea of power and control. I think that that's a really fundamental idea, and not necessarily. I think that's where I'll leave it. But yeah.
If you want to. Well, I have something to say. Go ahead. So, how this shows up in higher education, for me, because I've spent my entire life in academia, is that because I could read philosophy and I could be in conversation with people with penises, that somehow or another I was performing a kind of masculinity that, and a kind of academic, I was able to pontificate in a way that was intelligible, but anything with feeling or emotion or affect was diminished. And so even though I was reading theologies of culture, because it used particular discourse that was rational, propositional, it was acceptable, it was accepted. And so I then get conscripted into a kind of academic endeavor that can very well be toxic because it's void of the body. It's void of any emotionality, and it's just ideas floating in the ether. And so I get conscripted into toxic masculinity because of the way I speak, because of the way I write. I'm also gender nonconforming and have been masculine of center for many, many years. And so I get to be at the table with people with penises. And because I have these 3 little letters behind my name, I can be in conversation with people. But then who is at that table? And what are we perpetuating? And so I'm very intentional about who are the femme or the feminine or the female voices that actually need to participate in this conversation, because those are the people who are often most impacted by toxic masculinity.
Well, and Robin, you remind me there of this idea of credentialing, like credentialing people, like gatekeeping, providing external, kind of external affirmation of someone's ability to be in a space. And I think that academia is a great example of that, but we do it in all sorts of ways. And I think that feels like that's the logic of masculinity, saying, right, I get to affirm where, like, you get to come into this boundary, whatever it might be, so long as you meet this criteria or whatever it might be. Yeah.
Which is all part of supremacy culture.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would want to go back to something I actually think each of you have already touched on, which is it feels like part of toxic masculinity is this sort of tamping down of emotions other than anger. Like anger seems to be acceptable.
Like that's the only.
Yeah, and you're allowed to get angry if
and often encouraged.
Yeah, very much.
But not the kind of righteous anger that will create change.
No.
The kind of punitive, destructive anger that often perpetuates harm.
Exactly. And so I want to just offer a little bit from my experience that I think when we're not given permission or nurtured to be able to fully express the huge range of emotions that we are capable of as humans and that we just feel, then that is going to build up literal toxic poison inside, and it's gonna come out sideways or backwards onto somebody else. And so I've experienced that. I am a survivor of sexual assault, and the person who did this to me was, a cis man, a straight man. And I think that in all these years of healing, something I've come to really be present with is that he wasn't given these opportunities to safely emote. Now, I don't think that what he did is okay at all. I'm certainly not saying that that's okay, but I do think that in part of my healing process has had to involve looking at why would he do something like this? Why would anyone do something like this? Well, probably because there's something inside them that is still hurting, that's not had the attention or nurturing, right, that it needs. And so I think for the sake of everybody's emotional well-being, like how do we cultivate a generation of people with penises / people who identify as masculine that is different, right? I mean, I think that's a really important work. And then the other thing I just wanted to say is I just want to acknowledge, too, that up here we all appear white. There are 3 white people, 1 person of color who I would say identifies as white passing. And so there's a big part of this conversation that we actually can't really even touch around race. And so I just wanted to acknowledge, like, we're holding that power too, as we're up here trying to talk about toxic power.
Right. Well, can I jump in on that idea? I think a phrase I've heard, I think it was Joe Lumen said it yesterday, but this phrase that keeps resonating in my head is this idea of maladaptive behavior, maladaptive patterns in response to trauma. And I think what you point to is I can look at, say, my grandfather on my father's side as someone who, in my life, is textbook toxic masculine person. And I can look at the ways in which, as a child, I was like, well, he's just kind of an asshole. Like I just was like, I was able to just like easily say good, bad, a binary. But as I've gotten older and I'm able to have more maturity, I'm able to kind of see what were the things in his life, in his upbringing, in his environment, et cetera, that that led him to respond in that way. And I think that that's such a healthy, because it's so easy in this space to say, someone is toxic and therefore unclean, and therefore we cast them out, right? And I think it's definitely does not excuse harmful or bad behavior, but what it does say is, can we understand with compassion and also bring accountability together? So I just wanted to name that. I think it's so important.
Can I also say just one more thing around this maladaptive coping mechanism that supremacy culture is, that toxic masculinity is a technology of? I found several years ago, many of you know Dr. Tripp Fuller. He's a dear friend of mine, and he had me on his podcast, and he's had me on his podcast several times, and then all of a sudden, I had all these cis white men start to follow me. And I thought that was very strange, because so much of my work is pushing back on dominant culture, into which I'm also conscripted into. And I began to see this as an opportunity, actually, to model a kind of hermeneutic of suspicion and hermeneutic of retrieval, that white men are not the devil. Josh Scott is not the devil, even though he's Exhibit A in the tribute for today.
I did not know where that was going to go right away.
You are a stain on progressive Christianity,
I
which
am
is a good thing.
I'm a stain on the church, but
Yeah.
I'm not the devil.
So it's not that white men are the devil or the enemy. It's that white men, largely, have been cut off from this possibility to participate in affect and emotionality. And so when I saw these Theo bros, that's what they're called, if you were looking for a term, when I saw these Theo bros following me, I saw this as an opportunity to lean into a different kind of masculinity. That as a person who identifies as transmasculine, masculine of center, I've lived in a male world in academia for a very long time, that here was an opportunity to actually model masculinity in relationship with these Theo bros. And I've actually got some great conversations going. Why? Because there was this in-between space of uncertainty. These Theo bros couldn't quite pin me down on male or female. And I was like, I continued to invite them into conversation. And so we found this middle space, this place that I called Nepantla, this place of becoming. And that we could both lean into this place of becoming and it not be toxic. We could ask a lot of questions. And we could actually envision, okay, how do we want to live out our life? Do we want to continue to perpetuate harm? Do we want to continue to perpetuate the bullshit that we're all trying to disrupt? Or is there some other vision that we can cast for ourselves and each other? And so I spent a lot of time thanking the white men in my life for inviting me into this space, because it's actually a space where people are leaning into. It's a generative space. It's emergent in many respects. And that is not the version of masculinity that people are given. Largely, cis men are not invited into imagination, right? That's the woo-woo thing that women do. But could we generate a masculinity that is predicated on imagination? And then who do you become? Salud.
Can you say that last part again, what you just said?
Could we imagine masculinity predicated on imagination?
Yes.
Can we
okay.
lean into that?
Yeah.
And then who do we become?
Yeah. I think, so this is reminding me of when I was in undergrad, I majored in dance, and I have a background in dance, and I became really curious about this relationship between embodiment and gender, and how we may express our gender through performance. And so most of my work that I made, all the dances I made were about gender and sexuality and sort of those intersections and my perspective that they are very fluid. And people will often get like, man, I just had to argue with a family member about gender. And I had to remind her that like back, I don't know my history, but sometime maybe 1600s, 1700s, you can correct me if you know this. Men were wearing like high heels and lace and powder and curly wigs, and that was masculine.
Yep.
Because that signified that you had money, which signifies that you have power. So I argued that with her because I was like, well, these people were masculine, and if you wore that today, how would you be perceived, right? And I think there's this line that if you are perceived as something that is not masculine, then that is actually a challenge to your sexuality, right? So it could be, so then you're perceived as effeminate, which is obviously misogynist, but then it also puts into question something around your sexuality, right?
And emasculation is like, you don't want to be that because that's female.
Right.
Right.
When in fact, the people with uteruses possess in their bodies the power to create, literally deliver life, which I think is the biggest threat to toxic masculinity that there is, and that there's a body that they have no control over, and so it has to come out somewhere. I'm not suggesting that's how people live their lives, but there's something there to it. And so, I just wanted to say in terms of the way the body is and the movement aspect of things, what some of the research that I did was around the very few movement options that men are given. So like already you're asked to not express your emotions, but then you're also, if you make too big a gesture in space, then how will you be perceived? And so then that creates a particular type of embodiment where we're like constricted and you have to be sort of tough, and there's no other aspect of how you might embody how you feel or just how you want to express yourself. And so I learned from this choreographer, Joe Good, who's amazing. He's out of San Francisco, maybe. And he made this dance. He's a queer man, and he made this dance called 29 Effeminate Gestures. And so I built a lot of my work around that and sort of experimented with people wearing different clothing of different genders and doing these different gestures until we get really confused, right? Because it really is so arbitrary. Like, why just a couple hundred years ago were men wearing lace, and now they're supposed to be not wearing that if they want to be considered a man, right?
Right. Well, and I think you point to something really interesting, which is I think the underlying ethic of playfulness. That there's this, I think, the contrast to kind of the toxic, rigid masculinity that I grew up with was this idea of playfulness. And I think you're absolutely right in the sense that, yes, heels were developed in like the 1700s for men. So, but there's that sense of like, yeah, it is arbitrary. Like the thing that kills me, which is so funny, is like, when I wear a dress and I'm like, there's criticism of that. What's so funny is like, have y'all seen white Jesus in your Bibles? Like, it's fabric. Like seriously, like it's what's. That's the thing that's so interesting about it. It is playful.
You're just trying to be like Jesus.
Girl, I know. I am all about it. But it is that interesting idea of like both being arbitrary and also like arbitrary. Like the lines are arbitrary, and why they're drawn is for control and for power. It's an excuse to otherize, right? In this particular way around gender. And I think the anecdote to that is what you're pointing to, is this idea of playfulness. And that's not to say that everyone needs to feel comfortable like in every expression of particular gender, but I think what it does allow for is a sense of playfulness around even something like being adept at power tools. Right. these different expressions that we code in different ways. It's like, well, there's this whole range and spectrum of human behavior, human interest, human desire. So why are we boxing them into these different things and then judging ourselves by these arbitrary distinctions? It just sounds so odd.
I'm one of the best clothes ironers you will ever meet.
I'm gonna call you.
And here's what's interesting too. There is sort of this, like, there are things that men do and they don't do. And so men, they don't care about their clothes or their fashion. They just wear like carpenter jeans and stuff like you know what I'm saying?
And black t-shirts.
And black t-shirts. This has no carpenter loop. I ironed this
Exhibit
morning.
A.
Woke up early. But there's like this whole thing, like men do this, men don't do this, right? And so that if somebody walks in nicely dressed, a man walks in nicely dressed, then it's sort of like,
Okay.
he's a metrosexual. Actually, he just pressed his shirt. It's like he cares about. So the way we assign categories to like that's masculine. When you think about it, it just is so ridiculously absurd.
Well, and it's just truth because it's socially acceptable. I mean, it's a social construction, and we can see how social constructions have got us in a real bad place. When I spent my summers in Mexico growing up, my mom is from Mexico, my dad was white, and I would go and spend summers in Monterrey. And the ways in which relationship and people and bodies were together in that time, men, I don't know if white men do this. Josh, you can let me know.
I do speak for all of us.
Right. Like I said, Exhibit A. In Mexico, back 25 years ago, Latinos would hug and give 2 pats on the back and a kiss on the cheek. What do white men do?
There's several different things. I mean, it depends on how well you know somebody, but usually it's sort of like you put
A
your
side
hand
hug.
and you put your like, can we like, it's like, and then you pull it like,
Right.
and maybe you grunt.
Right. Yeah. So that's very interesting because at least in Latinx culture, there's a closer proximity of bodies together, and God forbid men touch bodies.
Yeah, I mean, I remember something. I spent some time in Rwanda in college, and even more so, there was this culture of moped taxis, right? And it was typically like younger men that would be their profession. And while they were on break, they would be sitting all up on each other's laps, holding hands, and that's masculine, right? And and I was like, ooh, I'm not comfortable with this like physical connection. And I think it just points again to this arbitrariness. But I think too, there are these ways in which I think we can say and identify this as maybe being not harmless, but maybe like less harmful, like talking about clothes, or like there are ways of safety. But I think it really does matter when we look at something like what's happening in Texas this week, where who gets to determine who controls what bodies in what setting, who gets to write the rules about what you get to do with your body. And I think, and it comes back to power. It comes back to who gets to draw the lines, where are those lines, and why are they arbitrary, and it has real consequences. And I think that I think is why toxic masculinity is so insidious, because it projects this kind of external, it's about our culture, it's about the ways that we flex, whatever. But what ends up, the end result behind that is control of folks, control of bodies.
Well, let me complicate this just a little bit, because we are not just here dissing on men or people with penises. White women also reinforce toxic masculinity. Yeah. And what happened in Texas is the result of the work of white women. And so when we are talking about disrupting toxic masculinity, we are calling in everybody, because we all participate in the bullshit. And it's each of our responsibilities to compost the bullshit, to create a more generative masculinity, a more generative femininity, if we want to use those terms, but really a more generous humanity.
It's making me think a little bit, Blake, what you were talking about to how this is connected into ableism. And so there's something, I don't know quite what the connection is, but it's like, for instance, for me, part of the way that I feel empowered in my own body is to be this strong, athletic dancer, right? But over time, I have danced so much and so hard that I have multiple injuries. And so now I can't express my strength in the same way anymore. And I'm also sitting with this loss of feeling of power. And it's just really fascinating to then go, wow, I'm ableist AF. And I'm also the one that's suffering from this. And so how do those things interconnect?
Well, can I speak to that? Because
Of course.
that brought up something for me. The the line that I think I can trace back and be like, the reason I left the church is rooted in this idea of masculinity and ableism. So in 2016, my father passed away, and he had, for his whole life, he had suffered with a birth defect that, I won't go into it, but essentially like made it to where his internal organs were constantly in flux. So he had some stomach issues as a kid, he had kidney issues when I was a kid, and it's just this kind of perpetual thing. And what I remember, and so because of that, he had a physical disability. You could see it clearly in his body. And I remember when he passed away, I was still in the church, still in church circles. And someone, I can't remember, several people actually, came up to me at his memorial service and said, I'm glad he has a new body in heaven. And that idea that bodies, that someone has, that bodies are redeemed into this particular way of being, that bodies cannot just exist in a diversity, that bodies cannot be on their own, I think is so critical to this understanding of masculinity. And I think the reason why that specific statement set a course for me to leave the church is because that's rooted in it too. It's rooted in this idea of our bodies living up to a standard, you know?
Yeah. It implies some type of stability. Like your body is this and it's never going to change. Yes. And unless you die.
Right, and control. You must be able to control your body. Yeah.
Which is why the emotion piece gets cut off.
Yes.
Because emotions are loose cannons.
Right. And they flow in and out. They're not permanent. Yeah, and so it makes me think of the work of, there's an embryologist, and he's also a philosopher. His name is Jaap van der Wal, and he suggests in all his years of research and science that that we actually are bodies using cells to become. And so if that's the case, like you have a new body every second, all the time, every day, and it's good. It's good. Your body is good. And that your body is your soul. Your body is using cells to become. I just think that is a fascinating way of looking at things, and it's a very different way to understand someone's body, and maybe perhaps but on a different end of the spectrum around ableism.
Right, and I think it's about, my mind goes to like settler colonialism, this idea of holding stable boundaries around a piece of property, right? And that there's almost a sense of violence in holding that boundary. And I think you point to an interesting idea of, if I conceptualize my body as a stable thing, as a thing to maintain boundaries with in that same way, then there's violence. Then there's violence connected and rooted in that. And that is, that's really hard. But that's such an interesting connection there of like, our bodies are constantly new. And not even just that, but we in our understanding and our development, we are constantly changing. I will be a different person tomorrow. I will be a different person in an hour. You know, that idea of us being constantly in flux and becoming, as Robin was pointing us to.
Well, we have 10 minutes left. Do we want to pivot to Q&R, or do you have
Sure.
do you want to take us down a different question?
Well, do you all feel like you've articulated anything around what you envision as I love to use the term, and I think maybe you've introduced this to me, or maybe it was in my research, but this idea of tender masculinity is you. Okay, so tender masculinity is one thing that gives me hope when I think about it. And I did also make a dance about tender masculinity, where it was male-bodied people who were just always touching, always being gentle with each other, and supporting each other, lifting each other up. So that's just like a physical way that I see this type of masculinity coming into fruition. But I'm just curious if anyone wants to speak more on that before we take a question.
Well, years ago, I was confronted with the trans community that because at the time I was not on testosterone, they were like, you're not trans because you're not trying to become a man. And I'm like, well, I'm not trying to be a man. I'm trying to imagine something other than that. Obviously, now I'm on testosterone and I've had to navigate masculinity in different ways. But during that time, during my doctoral program, I began thinking about masculinity on the terms of generosity or tenderness, that how, and I'm really interested in proximity to bodies. How can our bodies be with one another? I'm partnered to a dancer, so I think a lot in terms of choreography. So how can we choreograph our bodies in a togetherness? Because I think one of the things that masculinity does is cuts us off from connection, that we have a hard time connecting. And so I know that we're living in very strange times where we no longer handshake or we no longer hug, but I'm really curious how our bodies can dance together and how that dance can help us imagine a kind of masculinity that is a little bit more tender, a little bit more generous, a little bit more dynamic instead of staying in one, like not moving, not connecting.
Can I respond to that too? It also makes me think of, in my experience as someone who's like, I guess, femme-ish. I use they, them pronouns. I use she, her pronouns. I'm always just kind of flowing around in terms of gender, but I think I'm perceived as femme. And it's very interesting to just like walk down the street, and I am always expected to get out of the way, partly just because, and usually this is unfortunately cis men, they literally just don't have the awareness that they will ever have to get out of the way. And so is there like, how do we begin to even just shift little things like that? And so there's this almost binary between you can't move and you can't feel, and also you get to take up all the space that you want without any kind of repercussions. And so, just something to think about.
And I think, too, on that idea of connection that Robin was talking about, connection, yes, between people, but also with the earth. I mean, I think I mentioned my grandfather, who was like my example of toxic masculinity. But one of the things I saw in tender masculinity with him was he was a woodworker. And he would find these pieces of cherry wood or whatever, and would like carve them, right? And it was this, he talked about it in this very collaborative way of he is letting the piece of the earth, this piece of wood, kind of inform and dictate what he's doing and how he's crafting with it. So I like that idea of like, yes, in relationship with each other, but also with the world and being a collaborative part of the growth there.
Josh, you want to have the last word? You see what I did there? Or do you want to pivot to Q&R?
Pivot. No, I will say this. One thing for me has been, I was really fortunate. My dad was always expressive with me. Like as far as a kid, I can remember being hugged and kissed and those sorts of things by my dad. And I sort of had this period of my life where I really had no access to emotion, or at least, but becoming a parent, I do not know how it's possible. Like they just pull it out of me. If I talk about them, I'll probably cry. Mm-hmm. And that for me has been really grounding, and it's helped me unlock emotion in other ways. Like I cry at commercials sometimes because that's who I am now. And so I actually have
He's
a lot
also a 7 on the Enneagram, so he farts rainbow
Come on,
glitter.
7s. Yes, party time. I am also a 7. Yes.
Fantastic.
I know. Let's party.
I'll bring the iron, you bring the power tools.
Hell yes.
So I think we have a little less than 5 minutes, so we'll try to have just some brief Q&R.
And I'll repeat the question.
First of all, fellow 7.
Yes.
Dr. Robin, you spoke of cis men are not invited to imagination. Blake, you spoke of not being allowed to be playful. And what that brought for me was, coming of age in evangelical cultures where Paul was more important than Jesus. And Paul wrote in Corinthians, I used to think like a child, love like a child. And to me, that feels like part of the enculturation of men need to leave this
So the question is, what could a tender masculinity be that reclaims playfulness?
You had to bring Paul into it. No, it's fine. I think it's finding. I think it's about meeting halfway. So I think a lot of the time, and I experienced this when I was identified primarily as a man. Men tend to, at least in my experience, bond over activities. So it's finding ways in which we can curate, I find, those activities that encourage playfulness. Like, for example, I would go, another example of tender masculinity I had with some friends was we went rock climbing, which is very physical, very engaged, but there was also a sort of creativity to it because you're trying to solve problems. But I think it's trying to find ways in which we can have access points for playfulness that isn't going to the contrast to that was what we did at Justice Camp the other day, and just trying to find ways in which we can lead folks and meet them where they are, but encourage playfulness within whatever structures that
we
are
were
there.
dancing at Justice Camp.
Yes. Sorry, thank you.
Together.
I would just say, and I see some of our hands just very quickly, I would say, are we able to collaborate on our masculinity instead of just receiving a masculinity and then acquiescing to the thing? Because I received a certain way to be as a trans person, as a gender nonconforming person, as a masculine of center person, but actually what I received doesn't feel good to me. So are we able to collaborate? And in the collaboration, could that be where the playfulness emerges? Yes.
So I'm very involved in men's work, and I think the men's work I'm involved in is very embracing of what you're doing. But we're engaging a little bit with some non-binaries that are looking at our work, and they don't feel welcome. And I'm honestly confused about, is there such a thing as men's work? Should we be doing men's work? Is there women's work? Why are non-binary wanting to do men's work? Is there masculinity?
Well, it's socially constructed, and it's received as a thing. But Blake, I'm wondering if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, men are wonderful. Men exist, men identify as men. So I think, yes, there needs to be spaces for men. I think that's a healthy thing. And I think to get to, we're taking shots at Josh here, but I think there is a space for men to be themselves, to find a healthy sense of whatever that identity means, and more so even just more than what that identity means for them, but creating that identity, giving them the agency to understand, we can craft what's masculine in our own space and be comfortable with that. And I think that's a great thing. I think the problem is when men's groups or men become the measuring stick for everything else, right? So I remember growing up in church, and it was men and women groups were, always measured against each other or whatever. But I think there's definitely a healthy space for both. I am, as a non-binary person, I don't know if I'd feel particularly comfortable in a men's group, and that's okay. It's not for me. And just in the same way that a non-binary or a trans group wouldn't be necessarily the place for someone who might identify within a binary, perhaps. I don't know.
So obviously this is a very rich conversation. We could go for another hour, but we are out of time. We are being kicked out of the living room for the next session. If you have questions, I'm sure that we can hang around a little bit. But thank you so much for coming.
We appreciate you. Thank you so much.